When loyalty to the badge demands silence, would you risk everything to expose the truth? Follow one officer's journey through a darkness he never saw coming. Where justice demands more than courage, it demands sacrifice. The early morning light filtered through the windows of the precinct, casting long shadows across the concrete floors. Marcus Williams stood in front of the building, his hand slightly trembling as he adjusted the collar of his uniform. The weight of the badge on his chest felt heavier than he had expected, as if it carried the expectations of an entire department on its shoulders. It was a rite of passage for any officer, the first day on the job, but for Marcus, it felt more like a burden, a daunting reminder of the responsibility he was about to take on. The streets outside were already alive with the noise of the city. Cars honked, people bustled by, and the hum of a busy metropolis filled the air. But none of it seemed to reach Marcus. The sounds were muffled by the constant noise inside his head, a persistent buzz of uncertainty and doubt. He had wanted this moment for as long as he could remember. Being a cop wasn't just a job for him. It was a calling. It was about protecting the innocent, righting wrongs, and making the world just a little bit safer. At least, that's what he had been told. But now, standing here, about to start his first shift, he was realizing how little he knew about what it actually meant to wear the badge. Inside the precinct, it was a whirlwind of activity. Officers rushed in and out. Radios crackled with static, and the air smelled of stale coffee and paper. The clatter of boots on the tile floor was a constant rhythm, a reminder of how different things would be now that he was one of them. He had been to the academy, gone through the training, memorized the protocols, and passed the exams. But none of that could prepare him for what he would face on the streets. Nothing could prepare him for the kind of choices he would have to make, the kind of moral compromises that could push a man to his breaking point. As he walked through the precinct, trying to take it all in, he couldn't help but notice how the officers moved with purpose, each one seemingly consumed by their own world. There was no camaraderie, no warmth, just the cold efficiency of men and women who had learned to protect themselves above all else. He could feel the weight of their gazes as he passed, sizing him up, measuring him against the standards they had set. At the center of it all stood Sergeant Harris, an older officer with a permanent frown etched into his face. He was the kind of officer who had seen it all. Too much, perhaps, and carried the scars to prove it. His eyes flicked over Marcus briefly, assessing him in a way that made Marcus feel like a piece of meat at a butcher's counter. No words of encouragement, no welcome, just a grunt of acknowledgement as he moved past. The patrol car was a dark blue sedan, parked in the garage along with dozens of others. The familiar scent of leather and upholstery hit Marcus's nose as he climbed into the passenger seat. His partner for the day, Officer Gray, was already behind the wheel, his posture rigid and uncompromising. There was no small talk, no introductory pleasantries. Gray's eyes were fixed ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel as though he were preparing for something. Marcus couldn't quite place it, but there was a palpable tension in the air, a kind of simmering energy that made the car feel smaller than it really was. As they pulled out of the garage and into the streets, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The streets outside seemed different now, more ominous, more dangerous. The city that had always been his home, the place where he had grown up, suddenly felt foreign, alien. Every corner he turned, every streetlight he passed, seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. It wasn't long before they reached their first stop, a small, run-down convenience store at the edge of a neighborhood known for its high crime rate. Marcus had driven past this area 100 times before, but today, it felt like stepping into another world. The streets here were darker, the people more guarded. It was a place where every interaction could turn into a confrontation, where every stranger could be a threat, and Marcus felt the tension in his gut. Gray parked the car sharply at the curb, his eyes scanning the area like a hawk. There was no hesitation in his movements as he stepped out of the car, leaving Marcus to follow. The cold air hit Marcus's face as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the sound of his boots echoing against the pavement. He didn't know what to expect, but he had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. The man was standing outside the convenience store, looking out of place, almost too still for someone who was supposed to be in the middle of a busy street. His clothes were torn, his hair disheveled, and he carried himself with the sort of nervous energy that made Marcus uncomfortable. The man's eyes darted back and forth, searching for something or someone, but his gaze never quite landed on anything. When Gray approached, it was like a switch had flipped. The man tensed, his body going rigid, and Marcus couldn't help but notice the fear in his eyes. It wasn't just the fear of being caught, but the fear of something much deeper. Something that made Marcus uneasy, like he was about to witness something he wasn't supposed to see. Without a word, Gray moved toward him, his towering figure casting a long shadow over the man. He ordered the man to produce his ID. But when the man hesitated, Gray's patience wore thin. There was no warning, no effort to de-escalate the situation. Just a rough shove, pushing the man against the wall with such force that Marcus heard the man's body slam into the bricks. The impact made Marcus flinch, but his feet stayed rooted to the ground. He didn't know what to do, how to react. He had been trained to stop situations like this, but in that moment he froze. He could feel the weight of his badge, heavy against his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to act. The man pleaded with Gray, his voice shaking, but Gray wasn't listening. His focus was singular, his actions controlled by something that Marcus couldn't quite understand. It wasn't about law enforcement. It was about power. Who had it and who didn't. And right now, the man against the wall had no power at all. The scene unfolded in front of Marcus like a nightmare. He could hear the man's muffled cries, could see the panic in his eyes, but he stood there, paralyzed. It wasn't fear of the man, but of the man next to him. Fear of what would happen if he said something, if he stepped in. Fear of the consequences. The fear of Gray. The incident was over before Marcus could even process what had happened. Gray ordered the man to stay put and moved back to the car, as if nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. The man was left standing there, stunned, his body bruised and his pride shattered. Marcus climbed back into the car, his hands trembling slightly. He looked out the window, watching the man disappear into the crowd, but his mind was still on what he had just witnessed. He had been too scared to intervene, too frightened to do what he knew was right. But now, as the patrol car drove away, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a one-time thing. This was how things worked around here. This was how it always had been. When Marcus got home that evening, he thought little of the incident, his mind already turning to the next day's duties. But when he walked through the door of his apartment, a strange feeling washed over him. Something in the air was different. His mother's tired voice reached his ears as she welcomed him inside. And there, standing in the doorway with a tired smile, was the man he had seen earlier that day, Carlos. His face was softer now, his posture less rigid, and his clothes were clean. He wasn't a stranger to Marcus's mother, but to Marcus, it was like the world had suddenly shifted on its axis. Carlos wasn't just any man. He was his mother's new caregiver. The revelation hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. The same man that had been assaulted by Gray earlier in the day was now a part of his life. The guilt washed over him like a wave, and he felt like he had been carrying a weight all along without realizing it. It wasn't just that he had stood by while someone else suffered. It was that he had done so without questioning why. Carlos didn't deserve this. He had been a victim of something far worse than just physical assault. He had been caught in the same system that Marcus was now a part of, and Marcus didn't know how to fix that. But one thing was clear. Things were not going to stay the same. The city was cloaked in a gray morning light, restless and uneasy, with the early quiet broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Marcus sat alone in his patrol car, memories of the previous night gnawing at his conscience. Images of Carlos in that battered state, his shirt torn, his face bruised, haunted him. Gray had shown no mercy, gripping Carlos with a hardened contempt, adding fresh marks to wounds Carlos had likely earned earlier that night. Marcus had no clear explanation for Carlos's tattered appearance, other than an assumption that life had simply worn him down. Yet, in truth, it was more than Carlos's situation that left Marcus uneasy. It was his own inaction, the silence he had maintained, the helplessness he felt watching Gray's cruelty unfold. As he drove home, the guilt grew heavier, and he yearned to shake the remnants of his uniform, to wash away the residue of the previous night. Back at his small apartment, Marcus opened the door to find his mother seated as always, her face drawn but softened by a gentle smile. Beside her stood a familiar figure, and Marcus felt the shock settle over him instantly. Carlos, the man he'd seen the night before, was now standing in his living room, cleaned up, dressed in simple, unremarkable clothes, though faint bruises still lingered on his face. It was in that instant that the realization hit him, like a blow to the chest. Carlos was his mother's caregiver, the man she had eagerly mentioned would be joining them. Carlos's appearance now was in stark contrast to his state the previous night, and the realization unraveled a deeper guilt within Marcus. Here was the man he'd seen treated as a target of ridicule, subjected to Gray's unchecked authority. Now he was a part of his life, a man who would care for his mother, and Marcus had failed him when he needed help. As Marcus watched him, Carlos moved with a quiet competence, tending to his mother's needs with a care that made Marcus's shame grow more profound. There had been no hint of anger in Carlos's gaze when their eyes met, no silent accusation, only a reserved acceptance. Yet that only magnified the internal conflict stirring in Marcus's chest, the contempt he tried to keep buried now turning inward. The bruises on Carlos's face told their own story, a tale of the rough treatment he'd endured before encountering Gray. And now Marcus understood why Carlos's clothes had been torn. It was clear that he had crossed paths with trouble earlier that night, perhaps harassed by street gangs, and instead of finding help from Gray, he had been met with further brutality. As Marcus watched Carlos with his mother, he felt the rage rising within him. Gray's actions had crossed a line he could no longer ignore. This was personal now, not only an injustice, but a betrayal that struck at his own family. His silence the previous night had cost Carlos, and it was a mistake he wouldn't repeat. Once Carlos left, Marcus sat alone in the silence of his small apartment, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on him. He knew now that standing by would no longer be an option. Gray was protected by connections that ran deep, and Marcus would have to tread carefully. He couldn't risk a straightforward confrontation yet, but he knew he'd need evidence, hard, irrefutable proof of Gray's actions. Marcus considered the officer who oversaw the evidence room, a figure known for integrity and quiet loyalty to the captain. Though little was spoken openly, he sensed that the captain himself might be a force of protection, a presence he could trust. Perhaps, in this unseen network, he could find shelter as he worked toward exposing Gray's brutality. It was a tentative plan, but in the silence of that moment, it gave Marcus a glimmer of resolve. The path ahead was fraught with risk, but as Marcus sifted through the night's events, he knew there was no turning back. For Carlos, for his mother, and for the dignity he still clung to, Marcus was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The tension weighed heavily on Marcus as he left his mother's house, every step pulling him deeper into his conflicted thoughts. The encounter with Carlos had unraveled something he couldn't ignore. That torn shirt, the bruises on Carlos's face, and the lingering quietness in the young man's eyes. All of it resonated painfully in Marcus's mind. He had witnessed the brokenness left by Gray's actions, but had turned away in silent complicity. And now, that same man, that same battered figure, was here, a presence of kindness for his mother in her illness. The weight of his own choices bore down on him, unrelenting. The next day at the precinct, the routine bustle felt like static in Marcus's ears. Gray moved through the department with his usual swagger, exuding a smugness that set Marcus on edge. There were subtle interactions between Gray and some of the officers, a shared camaraderie that hinted at unspoken alliances. It became clearer by the day that Marcus was isolated, trapped in a silent role where loyalty to his badge conflicted with loyalty to his conscience. Each interaction was another reminder of the tightrope he walked, and every moment seemed to pull him closer to the edge. That evening, he reviewed the events with a sharpness of focus, recalling every moment that had led to Carlos's bruises. He remembered Gray's sneer, his indifferent violence, and the helplessness in Carlos's face as he was left there, sprawled on the pavement. Marcus replayed the scene repeatedly, the details sharpened by hindsight and haunted by regret. With each recollection, his unease grew, a simmering tension as he began to piece together Gray's true nature, his brutal disregard for anyone who didn't fit into his narrow view of who deserved respect. Marcus's discomfort grew into a quiet determination. Every morning, he found himself drawn to Carlos's situation, compelled by the look on his mother's face each time she spoke of her caregiver. The contrast between Gray's brutality and Carlos's quiet resilience gnawed at Marcus, unsettling him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He realized he could no longer ignore the gravity of the injustice, even if he wasn't yet ready to challenge it openly. But the memory of that day festered in him, a constant reminder of what he had turned a blind eye to, and he found himself questioning his silence. A few days later, Marcus noticed Gray was growing more suspicious. Gray's eyes lingered on Marcus, assessing, probing. There was a subtle shift in Gray's demeanor, a cautiousness that replaced his usual confidence, as though he sensed a threat looming. Marcus became aware that he was under scrutiny, his every action observed, his movements measured. Gray had become wary, and the realization made Marcus tense with anticipation. He knew that the slightest misstep could unravel everything, leaving him vulnerable to Gray's vindictive retaliation. The tension reached its peak late one night when Marcus returned home to find an anonymous note slipped under his door. The paper was simple, with bold, slanted handwriting warning him to watch his back. The message was chillingly ambiguous, a subtle threat that left little doubt about its source. Marcus held the note in his hand, feeling the weight of it press into his skin as he scanned his empty apartment, feeling the quiet but unnerving presence of someone watching from the shadows. The note was a reminder, a silent whisper from Gray, that he was being watched. Days turned into nights, and Marcus's life settled into a cautious rhythm, marked by careful interactions and restrained movements. He kept to himself, avoiding Gray's gaze and holding his silence even as the weight of what he'd witnessed bore down on him. But he knew his compliance was reaching a breaking point. His thoughts drifted repeatedly to his mother's caregiver, Carlos, whose bruises served as a haunting reminder of Marcus's inaction. One evening, on his way home from visiting his mother, Marcus found himself on a deserted street, the distant sounds of the city fading into the quiet murmur of his footsteps. He replayed the events in his mind, each memory sharpening his awareness of the power Gray held over him. The silence around him was deafening, filling the void left by his guilt, pressing into his thoughts with an unforgiving clarity. And in that silence, he made his decision. Marcus began taking cautious steps to gather evidence against Gray. He scoured the precinct, seeking out any subtle alliances that might work in his favor. Each day, he kept an eye on the evidence room, where a quiet, unassuming officer named Bennett handled the chain of custody. Bennett was known for his integrity, a steadfastness that even Gray's influence couldn't touch. Through careful observation, Marcus noted Bennett's loyalty to his job, and more subtly, his loyalty to someone beyond the precinct. It was as if an invisible hand guided Bennett's decisions, protecting him from the corrupt forces within. In quiet moments, Marcus began compiling a mental log of Gray's actions, noting his patrol habits, his interactions with subordinates, and his growing paranoia. He sensed the power Gray held over the precinct, the way his influence extended into every corner, twisting loyalties and blurring lines. But with each passing day, Marcus's fear lessened, replaced by a steely resolve. He began to notice Jasmine Latino Streamer, a young woman who frequented his block with a camera in hand. She had an energy to her, a raw courage that Marcus found unsettling but strangely inspiring. She captured moments on the streets, her camera a silent witness to the unfolding reality around her. Though she didn't know it, her recordings often overlapped with Marcus's patrol routes, creating a quiet partnership in documentation. Her footage could become valuable evidence, a means to expose Gray's actions without directly implicating Marcus. The days bled into each other as Marcus treaded carefully, aware of the danger lurking with each passing hour. His life became a series of calculated moves, a silent dance where one wrong step could pull him under. But his resolve held firm, strengthened by the knowledge that he was no longer just protecting himself. He was safeguarding Carlos, his mother, and the integrity of the badge he wore. One evening, as the city settled into a quiet lull, Marcus stood in his mother's doorway, watching Carlos with a somber sense of gratitude. Carlos moved with a gentle purpose, tending to his mother with a kindness that was absent from Gray's world. The bruises on his face had faded, but their memory lingered, fueling Marcus's determination. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with threats and shadows, but he was ready. The injustice he had once ignored was now a fire within him, a relentless force that drove him forward. The path was uncertain, each step marked by silent tension, but Marcus knew he could no longer turn back. He was committed, drawn deeper into the web of corruption and betrayal that Gray had woven, yet resolved to tear it down from the inside. The night felt heavy and thick, as if the air itself knew what lay on the horizon. Marcus walked a few paces behind Gray, his partner's figure silhouetted by the muted glow of distant streetlights. It was one of those long, tense patrols, the ones that stretched endlessly, filled with an unease that settled into his bones. Gray moved with a predatory ease, eyes scanning the streets, calculating, anticipating. Marcus knew that look by now, recognized the simmering aggression just beneath Gray's cool, confident exterior. Gray didn't walk these streets to protect. He walked them to dominate. They turned a corner onto a side street, and Marcus spotted a figure in the dim light. A young black teenager, maybe 16 at most, with his hoodie up and his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked nervous, shuffling, like he was waiting for someone. Just a kid. But Gray's posture shifted instantly, muscles tensing as his gaze narrowed. To him, this wasn't just a kid. It was an opportunity. Gray's pace quickened, his body language dripping with the threat of confrontation. Marcus followed, his own heart beginning to pound, a sick anticipation twisting in his gut. He wanted to call out, to tell Gray to take it easy, to treat the boy like any other kid who might be loitering after hours. But he held back, his voice swallowed by an invisible weight, the fear of what would come if he dared to intervene. As they neared, the kid straightened up, glancing nervously between them. Gray's steps were slow, methodical, his gaze icy as he closed in. Without warning, Gray reached out, gripping the teen's shoulder hard and spinning him around. Marcus watched, his throat tightening as the boy stumbled, arms flailing in surprise, his terrified gaze darting from Gray to Marcus and back. There was no time for him to explain, no chance to plead innocence. Gray shoved the boy to the ground, his actions swift and ruthless. The thud echoed down the empty street, loud enough to snap Marcus out of his haze of silent compliance. His partner stood over the teen, eyes cold, calculating, as he drew his weapon in a single, chilling motion. The muzzle aimed straight at the boy's chest, the darkness of the barrel almost blending into the shadows. Marcus's breath caught, his body frozen as he watched the scene unfold. It was a brutal display of power, an execution of authority, with no room for mercy or consideration. The boy's chest heaved, eyes wide with terror, and Marcus could see the tremble in his small frame, the terror in his unspoken plea for help. Every instinct in Marcus screamed at him to act, to reach out, to stop this before it went any further. But there was Gray, his partner, his superior, embodying the very power that Marcus had once believed in. He could feel the divide between them, a chasm that was widening with every silent second. In that moment, Marcus understood the reality of his role, the suffocating bind of his silence, but also the depths of his own conscience, his resolve hardening. He couldn't just stand by, not again. He thought of Carlos, of the brutalized figure he had witnessed before, an immigrant left at Gray's mercy, stripped of dignity and protection. He remembered the day he'd gone home, shoulders heavy, only to find that Carlos was there as his mother's caregiver. The revelation had gutted him, twisted his shame into something darker, something that gnawed at him night after night. And here he was again, watching Gray inflict the same terror, the same pain, upon another vulnerable soul. As Gray holstered his weapon with a satisfied smirk, Marcus felt the steel settle in his spine. This had gone too far. He had no choice left but to act. Over the next few days, Marcus operated in near-constant tension, his every movement calculated, his gaze sharp and aware. He began gathering evidence methodically, silently documenting every brutal encounter, every oppressive move Gray made. His phone became a hidden tool, capturing fleeting moments when Gray was unaware. He watched Gray's confrontations with an almost clinical detachment, capturing them in his mind, in notes, in photos, in recorded whispers of conversations. Each piece was a small rebellion, a way to chip away at the shield of authority Gray wielded so viciously. Gray, however, was not an oblivious man. He could sense a change in Marcus, a subtle shift in his demeanor. There was a resistance in his gaze, a quiet defiance that wasn't there before. Gray started watching him, his sharp eyes narrowing whenever Marcus was near. The tension between them grew, a silent war fought through sidelong glances and curt responses. Gray began planting subtle seeds of doubt among their colleagues, spreading quiet rumors, casting shadows on Marcus's loyalty and reliability. The isolation was suffocating. Marcus moved through the precinct like a ghost, his every interaction laced with suspicion. He could feel Gray's influence everywhere, the suspicious looks from other officers, the sudden coldness from those he once considered friends. But he pressed on, driven by a purpose stronger than the fear constricting his throat. One night, when the precinct was quiet, Marcus found himself drawn to the evidence room. There, in the dim light, he combed through the records, searching for anything that could add to the growing case he was building against Gray. As he moved through the files, he noticed something strange, a folder left out on the counter, a single, nondescript file that seemed almost out of place. His eyes skimmed over it, noting the details, piecing together a quiet realization. Someone knew what he was doing, and, perhaps, was helping him. The contents of the folder were damning. A record of Gray's previous encounters, carefully documented but hidden in layers of red tape, now conveniently accessible. Marcus's mind raced, his instincts screaming caution, but he couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't alone in this fight. He pocketed the evidence, feeling a renewed surge of resolve. Whoever had left the file knew the stakes and, in their own quiet way, was pushing him forward. But Gray wasn't finished with his intimidation tactics. He cornered Marcus one evening during a routine patrol, his face an unyielding mask of menace. There was something different in his gaze this time, a hard gleam that sent a cold spike of fear down Marcus's spine. He didn't need words to understand the warning in Gray's eyes, the thinly veiled threat that radiated off him like a heat wave. It was a promise, one that whispered of violence and retribution, of a darkness that stretched beyond the badge and into something more sinister. Marcus swallowed the fear, standing his ground, his gaze locked onto Gray's with a newfound intensity. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. This was his line in the sand, the moment he claimed back his integrity, his purpose. Gray's lips twisted in a cruel smile, as if savoring the tension, the defiance, but Marcus didn't falter. When he returned home that night, the weight of his choices settled onto his shoulders like a leaden cloak. He was more alone than ever, the walls closing in as he realized just how dangerous this path had become. But his resolve remained unbroken, his determination as solid as the evidence he was amassing. Sitting alone in the dark, he ran his fingers over the small stash of recordings, the photos, the testimonies he had gathered from silent allies and vulnerable witnesses. He was crafting a narrative, a truth that would strip away Gray's facade and expose him for the monster he was. The road ahead was treacherous, and Marcus knew that he might lose everything before he was done. But he could no longer turn a blind eye, no longer ignore the brutality that had infected the very foundation of the force he once believed in. With each passing day, he felt the stakes rising, the quiet danger growing around him like a tightening noose. The final confrontation was coming, a reckoning that would pit him against Gray in a battle for truth and justice. And in that still, dark room, with only the hum of the city outside, Marcus made his peace with it. No matter the cost, he would see this through. The message arrived like a slap across Marcus's senses. It was simple, scrawled hastily on the back of a police report, a location on the outskirts of town, and one ominous word: come. He felt the cold prickle of dread skittering down his spine as he pieced it together. Jasmine was gone, taken by Gray in a final, desperate attempt to crush him. Marcus clenched the note, the edges biting into his palm as he made his choice. This would end tonight. He drove through the city's dim streets, his mind racing with every terrible possibility. The address led to an old warehouse, its metal siding corroded, sagging against the weight of time. Shadows pooled around the building's perimeter as Marcus parked nearby, slipping from his car without a sound. His senses honed, every sight, every sound, attuned to the subtle signs of Gray's presence. His fingers grazed the outline of his pocket knife, the cool metal grounding him as he crept forward. Inside, the warehouse was a cavernous maze of discarded machinery, shafts of moonlight cutting through broken windows to scatter weak pools of light. Marcus edged along the walls, his steps carefully muted against the concrete floor. Then, a voice sliced through the stillness, a low, taunting murmur, just out of sight. Gray stood waiting in the shadows, his posture relaxed yet charged with menace. His hand gripped a handgun, his gaze sharp and mocking. He held it pointed slightly downward, a careless yet calculated gesture. Marcus froze, his muscles coiled with tension, his gaze sweeping the room for any hint of Jasmine. Gray's voice dripped with malice as he took a slow step forward. "Didn't think you'd actually come alone. I thought I taught you better than that, Marcus." Without warning, Gray's gun lifted, the muzzle glinting cold in the low light. Marcus darted behind a rusted pillar as Gray's first shot rang out, ricocheting off the metal in a shriek of sparks. Marcus felt the burn of pain as the bullet grazed his upper arm, the sudden shock of it like a brand searing into his skin. He stifled a gasp, pressing himself tightly against the wall. Blood dripped from the wound, hot and sticky, trickling down his arm. Gray's footsteps moved closer, deliberate, echoing across the hollow space. Marcus's mind raced through his options, weighing his training against the limitations of the situation. He forced his breathing to slow, his senses sharpening as he tuned into the subtle cues of Gray's movements. His Marine training surfaced, instincts from long ago combat pushing him to stay hidden, to stay alive. He moved in silence, keeping low, scanning for anything he could use to his advantage. The building was a chaos of forgotten equipment, rusted pipes, and debris strewn across the floor. And then he saw it, an old oil drum lying tipped on its side. Marcus reached out, nudging it with his foot, sending it clattering across the floor. Gray's attention snapped toward the sound, and Marcus seized the opportunity, slipping to the opposite side of the room, hidden in the darkness. He was close enough now to see the tension rippling through Gray's body, the grip on his gun tightening. Marcus stayed silent, watching for an opening, moving like a shadow through the cavernous space. In a single swift motion, Gray spun around, scanning the darkness. The glint of the gun held steady. Another heartbeat, and Marcus leapt from the shadows, his momentum carrying him forward as he tackled Gray to the ground. The gun clattered from Gray's hand, skidding across the floor. Marcus's fists landed solid, punishing blows, each one channeling the pent-up anger and frustration that had been festering inside him for weeks. Gray was tough, resilient, swinging back with brutal force. But Marcus's training gave him an edge. He deflected a punch aimed at his face, his arm coming down hard on Gray's wrist, pinning him. Gray's sneer faded, replaced by a flash of panic as he struggled beneath Marcus's iron grip. Marcus pressed harder, his breathing labored, his vision narrowing to Gray's defiant gaze. He felt his hand tremble, a hesitation slipping into his movements. But then he remembered Jasmine, remembered the cruelty he had seen, and any trace of doubt vanished. In one decisive move, he subdued Gray, his body going slack beneath Marcus's weight. He held his position for a beat longer, making sure Gray was truly incapacitated, before finally easing back. As Marcus straightened, he saw a glimmer of movement in the shadows. Jasmine was bound to a chair at the far side of the room, her eyes wide with fear and relief as she met his gaze. He moved to her side, his fingers working quickly to untie the ropes that bit into her wrists. Jasmine's arms fell free, and she rubbed at her wrists, her breaths ragged but steady. She cast a wary glance toward Gray's motionless form, her shoulders slumping as the danger ebbed. Together, They moved toward the exit, each step echoing in the empty space behind them. Marcus felt the weight of the night's events settle onto his shoulders, but also a strange, fierce relief. They had survived together, against all odds. As they stepped out into the night, Marcus turned back for one last look at the darkened warehouse. The city lights glowed in the distance, a beacon pulling them forward. The air was still, thick with the residual tension of the encounter. But something else lingered too, a quiet determination. Marcus knew their victory was incomplete. Gray was incapacitated, but the corruption he represented ran deep, spreading through the precinct like a shadow. Under the weight of his decision, Marcus found himself navigating an increasingly perilous labyrinth, where every turn led him closer to danger. The initial rush of satisfaction at having rescued Jasmine was short-lived, overshadowed by the tidal wave of repercussions coming from within the police department itself. Gray's allies, a network of officers bound by a mix of loyalty and fear, closed ranks, their support reinforcing Gray's sense of invincibility. They kept silent, watching Marcus with cold suspicion, as if he were an intruder in his own house. From subtle shifts in tone to outright dismissals in meetings, Marcus could feel the walls closing in. His former partners, men he had once respected, now seemed to weigh his every word and movement, as if judging whether he still deserved the badge pinned to his chest. Small gestures, like coffee left untouched or a glance held a beat too long, reminded him of just how isolated he'd become. The whispers followed him through every hallway, reminders of the unspoken loyalty that kept Gray's actions shrouded in silence. In those moments, the sense of betrayal was almost unbearable. It felt as though he was fighting an enemy as elusive as smoke, one that moved just out of reach but was dense enough to smother him. But he clung to the belief that justice, no matter how bruised and battered, could still prevail if he was relentless enough. Jasmine's footage offered him a lifeline. Her video, captured in the grainy clarity of her phone camera, held the power to tell the truth he alone couldn't voice. Under the cover of night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, sifting through the evidence he'd gathered like precious artifacts. The images of Gray's rage, the heavy, unforgiving hand slamming Carlos to the ground, stared back at him with a mute testament to the violence that ran unchecked through the ranks. He felt the gravity of the decision he was about to make. To release the footage was to invite the wrath of a system designed to shield its own, to willingly paint a target on his back. The leak itself was a quiet affair, a simple upload to an anonymous channel, but the ripples it sent out were anything but silent. Almost immediately, the footage found its way into the hands of local media, and within hours, the story ignited a firestorm. Clips of the video looped across TV screens, capturing Gray's brutality in a raw, unfiltered light that no one could deny. The backlash was swift, the outrage visceral. Viewers recoiled at the sight, their collective voice rising in demand for accountability. As Marcus watched the coverage, a fleeting sense of vindication washed over him. This was the truth laid bare, unmasked for all to see. But with it came a grim realization. Gray wouldn't take this lightly. Within the department, tensions crackled, the silence between officers thickening into a palpable unease. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, a silent threat from those who had pledged their loyalty to Gray. In their minds, he had crossed a line, one that shouldn't be crossed. Days blurred together, each one marked by new threats from Gray, each more brazen than the last. Gray's words carried a chilling undertone, an unspoken promise of what would come if Marcus continued his crusade. The anger that had smoldered beneath Gray's calm facade erupted with a viciousness Marcus hadn't anticipated. There were no more quiet warnings. Now, Gray's taunts grew louder, more public, leaving no doubt about his intentions. "You think you're untouchable," Gray sneered one day in the precinct parking lot, his voice dripping with contempt. Marcus felt the sting of the words, but he refused to flinch. Gray's eyes held a malice that sent a shiver down his spine, but he stood his ground, feeling the weight of every silent officer watching from a distance. This was Gray's domain, the shadowed arena where he wielded unchecked power. Yet here Marcus stood, daring to defy it. The more Marcus pushed, the more unhinged Gray seemed to become, lashing out with an almost manic intensity. Marcus could see the desperation lurking behind Gray's anger, the realization that his carefully constructed fortress of lies and intimidation was beginning to crumble. But that only made him more dangerous, like a cornered animal ready to strike. Despite the mounting threats, Marcus felt an unexpected resilience growing within him. Each step forward was a defiance, a refusal to back down in the face of fear. He was driven not only by his need to see Gray held accountable, but by the voices of those who had been silenced before him. This wasn't just about Carlos anymore, nor was it about the young teenager Gray had assaulted. It was about justice for every victim who had been crushed beneath the weight of the system's indifference. As Marcus walked through the stark, imposing corridors of the precinct, every step seemed to echo louder than the last. The gravity of his choices weighed heavily, knowing that exposing Gray had made him a target within the department. He'd received the notice for this review board hearing only hours earlier, and he sensed it would be far more consequential than any previous disciplinary proceeding. His heart raced as he approached the cold, metallic doors that loomed at the end of the hall, each step toward them a reminder of the lonely path he had chosen by standing up against his own. He pushed open the door, stepping into the sterile meeting room where the review board awaited. Rows of serious faces lined the room, most of them unreadable, some barely masking disdain. At the head of the table sat an elderly officer, tall and dignified, his face etched with years of service. The officer's gaze bore into Marcus with an intensity that felt familiar yet unsettling. Marcus's breath caught as he looked closer, noticing small details, a hint of recognition in the officer's eyes, a slight shift in his demeanor that spoke volumes. As the silence stretched, the elderly officer leaned forward, his voice calm yet firm, tinged with an authority that commanded the room's attention. In that stillness, Marcus felt a strange sense of recognition. The officer's eyes were calm, yet piercing, as if they carried a story only Marcus would understand. And then, as the words fell from the officer's mouth, it was as if time stopped. Marcus finally understood this man, the one sitting in judgment of him, was Captain Jonathan Williams, his father, the one who had left him and his mother all those years ago. The revelation struck with a force that left Marcus speechless. His mind raced, processing the fact that this man, the captain, was the father he'd only ever known through old photographs and stories his mother had told him in rare, painful moments. He fought to maintain composure, to stay steady under the weight of the realization, but the mixture of shock and betrayal swirled within him. It felt as if his entire past had been rewritten in an instant. Captain Williams looked at him with something close to sorrow, his own emotions barely concealed beneath the hardened exterior. Years of distance had left their mark, but there was also a hint of pride in his gaze, an acknowledgement of the strength it took for Marcus to stand here, unwavering. As Marcus processed the implications of his father's presence, he felt a complex wave of resentment and, somehow, a glimmer of reassurance. In that moment, Captain Williams took control of the proceedings. With a calm authority that brooked no argument, he addressed the assembled officers, cutting through any lingering doubts. His words were methodical, measured, and directed squarely at the issue of corruption that had tainted the department for so long. Williams laid out the severity of Gray's actions, drawing attention to the evidence Marcus had risked everything to reveal. His voice rose, underscoring the need for accountability, and as he spoke, a quiet awe settled over the room. The very system that Marcus had feared would turn against him was now being shaken by his father's presence. Gray's fate was sealed with swift finality. As the captain's voice echoed through the room, there was a collective realization that a new era of transparency was dawning, spurred by the courage of a young officer who had dared to speak truth to power. Marcus watched as Williams ordered Gray's immediate arrest, a swift and unyielding end to a reign of intimidation that had gone unchecked for too long. Marcus felt the sense of justice finally being served, the weight of it freeing him from the fears he'd harbored since he first took a stand. As the officers began to disperse, Williams finally turned to Marcus, his expression a mixture of regret and respect. There was no need for words. The years of separation and the choices they'd each made had led them to this moment of silent understanding. Williams had spent years watching Marcus's journey from afar, aware of his son's struggles, but powerless to intervene directly, until now. For Marcus, the revelation of his father's involvement was bittersweet. He had made his way through the storm alone, and only now did he understand that, in some ways, his father had been there, watching from the shadows, offering support in ways Marcus hadn't known. It felt like a strange form of closure, a new chapter beginning even as the dust settled on an old wound. With Gray's removal and the backing of his father, Marcus could finally look forward, not as a lone crusader, but as a force for change, empowered by the quiet support of the family he'd thought he'd lost. As they walked out of the sterile room, Marcus felt a renewed strength, an affirmation of his path forward. He was no longer just an officer battling injustice alone. He was now part of a legacy, a line of integrity his father had chosen to pass down through action, not words. And together, they would continue the work of restoring justice, one step at a time. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit subscribe and join our community. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in Marcus's shoes? Let's keep the conversation going together.